Hello everyone. I'd like to do a short introduction before I start this series on complex trauma. So my name is Dr. Ann Gillies, and I have been a psychotherapist and treated survivors of complex trauma for over 25 years. So what is complex trauma? Well, I'm going to go into that in great detail over this next series of teachings. But basically, the people that I have worked with are people who have experienced chronic childhood sexual abuse of one kind or another. So that could be ritual abuse, it could be family, intergenerational abuse, incest, torture, kidnapping, and repeated rape, those kind of things. So that's a little bit about my background experientially. Academically, I trained first of all in a Bachelor of Religious Education and counseling major. And so right through from my bachelor's to my Ph.D., I've kept the track of both theology and psychology. And I would say I'm probably a specialist in the merging of those two together. I believe in a scriptural foundation for life and for living life well. And at the same time, I believe that God has given wisdom and insight into the area of psychology and psychological processing, mental processing, that we can learn a lot from. So I'm going to be doing this series. I'm going to do several series actually over the course of the next year. And I hope that you will enjoy these. I'm going to try to keep them to under 30 minutes at a time. Now, some of these talks will be from an academic perspective, but I'm trying to keep it simple enough that those who aren't in academia, and there's no crown for being in academia, believe me, those who are not aren't inhibited by some of the language. So if you're finding any of my language misunderstandable, or you're not able to understand it, I can't even talk. See, there you go. Don't even know the English language, misunderstandable. Anyways, if you're finding it difficult to understand some of the wording, please find a way to connect with me. Maybe at the end of this program, you can connect with my website, which will be on the video, and just ask me those questions, and I'll try to help as best I can. So let's start. We're going to start on the topic of complex traumatic stress disorder. So what is that? Well, it is a diagnosable condition. It includes symptoms of PTSD. Now, PTSD is a short form for post-traumatic stress disorder. This has become quite a familiar acronym in our culture today, world culture, and what PTSD is something that I'm going to describe as we go along. So stay tuned. This is just an overview, an introduction of complex traumatic stress disorder, and I'm going to get more descriptive as I go along. It is, I would say, it has a deeper level of emotionality, of functionality, and it really affects the individual in such a primary way, emotionally, and how they react to individuals, to other people, that it is very, very complex. So it has been identified in the lives of those who've been chronically sexually abused, so childhood survivors of abuse, and it also encompasses many other different kinds of abuse. So let me continue and talk about different stressors that can create post-traumatic stress disorder, or subsequently complex traumatic stress disorder. And hopefully you can follow along in this talk with the PowerPoint that I'm presenting in the corner of this talk. So the widely different stressors can be from war trauma. Certainly our soldiers, those who are actively engaged in military endeavors, those who return home after engagement can experience war trauma, and that can happen spontaneously, and it shocks a person because all of a sudden they feel all of this panic arise within them. Also, physical assaults can result in post-traumatic stress disorder. And we talked about sexual assaults. Absolutely, they will create traumas. Accidents. So, for instance, a severe car accident. And when you think of that, if you have ever been in a car accident or a machinery and equipment accident, think of any kind of severe accident. At the moment of impact of the cars, right? So I'm talking about that right now. At the moment of impact, there is often this amnesia that takes place for the individual in the accident. And often they will not be able to describe that moment. They can describe the 5 minutes previous, the moment up to the impact, and they can describe the scene afterwards. But often it's like this blockage happens in the brain. And I think it's a survival mechanism that actually God has given us. It's amazing that we can block out traumatic experiences at some level. The very basic level where the fear is contained. And we'll talk about that a little bit later as well, that blockage. So accidents can result in post-traumatic stress disorder. Natural disasters, tornadoes, tsunamis, what other kind of thing? Flooding, fires. You know, think of the astronomical effect of being caught in a forest fire or a house fire and surviving, and the aftermath emotionally of that, especially if someone else has died. There'll be survival grief. You feel like, why did I survive? And we'll talk about many other things in other workshops I'll be doing. And then, of course, man-made disasters, war being the biggest one that I can think of. So there are major factors predicting psychological trauma. So here's some predictors of the trauma that you may experience. So fear of torture, if there's ever been that fear of sexual assault or sexual assault. See, just even the fear of it happening. So being in a situation where there's danger can result in that traumatic experience. Watching someone else die or experiencing extreme pain or physical injury. And I know my eldest son had actually not watched someone die, but actually had come across a friend who had committed suicide and hung himself. And my son was the one to discover him. There's a wound that happens. Now, he may not exhibit long-term effects of trauma with that, but there's an impact on our psyche when we see that, when we see something that has happened that is so devastating to the soul. And you know, also if there's a belief of failed responsibility that results in the harm of others. And so for my son, there was that kind of belief going on. If I could have done something, if I could have shown up sooner. If I had have known, if he had have told me that this is what he was planning, I could have stopped it. And so survival guilt really clicks in. So here's some other factors. Acute physical injury, disfigurement, dismemberment, or disability. Those kind of things obviously create an impact to the soul, a wounding to the soul, and a deep psychological trauma. Also the fear of being disfigured forever. And I have another son who actually had flesh-eating disease, and it was caught. I mean, that's a whole miracle in itself. He went to the hospital because he'd fallen off his bicycle, and he was disoriented, and he felt he didn't feel any physical other than a stubbed toe, but he was so disoriented, and he was near a hospital, and so he went into the hospital. And the doctor on call at Emerge was so astute. Immediately he looked at my son and saw something that he just was afraid about. And it turned out that my son had flesh-eating disease, and this doctor picked up on it immediately. It saved my son's life. In the meantime, my son nearly lost his arm. And so that meant that he had subsequent surgeries because they tried to stop the flesh-eating disease at his wrist, and they thought they had it contained. And so we were kind of going, oh, thank you, Lord. And then the next morning, as I'm entering the hospital, they're rushing him into the elevator to take him down for surgery, because through the night, and you could see it, the disease had further gone up his arm, and it was almost to his elbow. And so they were saying he's probably going to lose his arm. They were just amazing. He kept his arm, but the disfigurement to his arm later was hard on him. He turned to me one day and he said, "Mom, who is ever going to love me with such an arm as this?" And I said to him, "A person who loves you will love you no matter what you look like." But that's the kind of thing that happens in the mind. And so the fear of, or actual disfigurement, dismemberment, fear of losing one's life, being in a situation, whether it's an accident or in a situation where you're being robbed, where someone is being raped, where it is a kidnapping or a military event, the fear of losing one's life creates deep traumatic impact, and of course torture as well. Those things would seem to be, yes, that just makes perfect sense, right? Also, major factors include the feelings of shame, of guilt, of war. We've talked about that. That is not a feeling, but the factor of war and the fighting that creates a post-traumatic stress disorder, and then environmental or ecological catastrophe. So we've touched on those kind of things. So I think you're getting a little bit of an idea of some of the issues that can begin, that can automatically, quickly create post-traumatic stress disorder. So now I'm going to talk a little bit more about breaking it down. What is post-traumatic stress disorder? I've shown you some of the events that can create it. So let's talk about the actual kind of academics of it. So there are different acronyms, but let's take this in two steps. First of all, first is APTS, or often people just cut out the A and PTS, say PTS, post-traumatic stress, or you can say acute post-traumatic stress. So those are emotional reactions to an event, which I've talked about, any kind of those events. And these reactions last up to 30 days. So this is what I want to say about this of PTS. post-traumatic stress, this is a normal reaction, a normal response to an abnormal situation. So it's an emotional reaction. You can't stop it. It just happens. And it is absolutely normal to have such a reaction to an abnormal situation. And then we have PTSD, which I have been talking about. So post-traumatic stress disorder. And this is a diagnosable disorder. That means if you went to a mental health provider, a psychiatrist or a psychologist, they would be able to diagnose you with post-traumatic stress disorder. And that is simply the post-traumatic stress that you've maybe experienced initially, continuing over 30 days. So you would have had to have the effects and the reactions of the trauma continuing over a 30-day time period. It's unrelenting, and it creates a disability, an inability to function on a normal day-to-day level. Now, I want to say this right off the start. For many of you will never ever see a psychologist or a psychiatrist or mental health worker because you're not in countries where those are readily available, or even if you are, the cost of seeing someone like this is astronomical. And for someone with post-traumatic stress disorder, they're going to need to see someone for probably about 12 sessions, an hour long a session. That's if they have what I would call simple post-traumatic stress disorder. So what about the rest of us? Well, that's why I'm talking, and that's why I want to be able to present some helpful tools, things that can help you along the way. And so this talk and the next several following it are simply presenting some of the symptoms, some of the symptomology, explaining what these kind of conditions are, and then we'll go into more detail on kind of what can be done individually to help someone or to even help yourself. And I hope that's going to help you understand why it's going to take several of these talks to even begin to break this down a little bit more. So the prevalence of post-traumatic stress disorder is the most common among psychiatric disorders. Now let me tell you something. When I started my private practice and seeing individuals, it turned out, with complex traumatic stress disorder, that's not where I had planned to actually spend my time. In fact, I just thought I would see people who are in troubled marriages, perhaps families, those kind of things, and that's all well and good. But actually, one of my first clients threw me into the deep end of the swimming pool, into the area of trauma. And I began to realize, and this was, maybe my third client, maybe my fourth client, that there is so much more under the surface of what counselors typically look for. And I began to think, I need to understand this person's incredible history, right from pre-birth, if they have any knowledge of that, of their parents and grandparents and all that, the generational part of it, but also their history as they explain it to me as much as they can remember. And there's many things I look for as they begin to talk about their lives. Gaps that are unexplainable in their memory is one big highlight for me. And as I go through with them, talking about their history, just as their emotion begins to surface, it begins to be more evident. There's some things sometimes that they maybe aren't talking about that are creating irritability within them. You can see bodily changes as they kind of crunch up. There's all kinds of things. So I began to think, wow, this isn't just about counseling. There is something so much more deeper that most counseling techniques, so for instance, cognitive behavioral therapy, reality therapy, even emotionally focused therapy, those are all good tools. But if we don't understand and help the client understand their personal history, trauma history, we will miss the mark. So that's why I focus so much on trauma. So lifetime prevalence of trauma is between 1 and 9% of the population, and at least 15% of the psychiatric population, according to statistics. But I want to tell you that the lifetime prevalence of trauma from someone who has been seeing traumatized individuals and their families is far higher. And you and I know that trauma can create such deep holes in our psyche, in our soul, in our emotions. And that now, like 25 years ago, trauma was hardly talked about in psychology. It was there, but you know what? It wasn't seen as a root cause. But from my first clients onward, I saw trauma as the root rather than the fruit of different disorders that could be diagnosable. And I may talk about that extensively later because I have my own theory on that. And I truly believe that trauma is what mental health providers need to be looking at rather than labeling individuals with diagnoses. Anyways, I could get on a rabbit trail with that, but let me continue. Let me show you this little graph. This is a pie graph of 3 core symptoms, clusters. They're clusters of symptoms. So we're going to break down each one of those. But first of all, what will happen in the emotions is hyperarousal of the individual in certain conditions. They just startle reflex, or they're just on guard. There's a hyperarousal that happens when the individual is confronting a similar situation as to what happened to them previously. There's also tends to be avoidance of certain situations, which makes total sense. And so sometimes large crowds. Traumatized victims or survivors of trauma often have great difficulty going into a church building, for instance, or sitting in church. It's very difficult for them. They may want to be there, but the crowds or the people around them is actually triggering some stuff within them. And so the avoidance of those kind of places where they may once have frequented, and there's a hyperarousal on one hand, there's often avoidance, and then there is this cluster of symptoms that happens with re-experiencing the trauma. So I'm going to break those down as we go along, and I'm just going to spend a little bit of time on that before we finish today's video. So the symptoms of PTSD and the 3 major symptoms that I just mentioned are re-experiencing. So these symptoms occur when aspects of the traumatic event that has previously been experienced are relived in some way. So it is this sense of, so just a simple one for soldiers coming back from war. And in Canada, for instance, on Canada Day, we have fireworks and we have celebrations. It's very loud and very noisy, and parades and those kind of things. Not this year because we had COVID-19 happening, but typically there will be fireworks. And often for soldiers who have come back from war, fireworks going off. So someone in their backyard setting off fireworks can create a re-experiencing aspect for the soldier. And or a fire truck or an ambulance going by can do the same thing. And all of a sudden, all of the memory, you have the memory and emotion just surge up within that individual, and it incapacitates them. Sometimes they hit the ground just like that, like they would have done if a missile had been, going over their head in wartime, or a bullet, or something like that. There's an immediate response, and people nearby may be going, "What's wrong with this person?" Well, it's a re-experiencing effect of previous trauma. Also, avoidance. Okay, so symptoms of avoidance include attempts of staying away, like I talked about, from triggering locations or people even who would trigger the emotion or response. So there's also amnesia. Can't speak here. Amnesia. So that's kind of that blocking out I talked about when someone has been in an accident. That amnesia for traumatic events that falls under the avoidance category, and we can talk about that later as well. Then the third one then is hyperarousal. So what does that really mean? And this is the final one I'm going to talk about today, and then we'll start up again in the next video. But hyperarousal includes symptoms of being constantly on high alert. So it's like your whole system is on alert, and it takes tremendous energy to be on high alert all the time for danger. But that's what someone with post-traumatic stress disorder will experience. And they experience high anxiety all the time. Also, angry outbursts just out of nowhere, irritability and sleep disturbance. Now remember that this can also occur, all of these three symptoms can occur with acute post-traumatic stress or post-traumatic stress. So the symptoms here would last under 30 days in duration. And so for those who have experienced such things, all of a sudden you're going, wow, that happened to me. Or for others, you may say, wow, that happened to my son, or that happened to my cousin. Now I understand why they behave like they behave. So sleep disturbances, not able to sleep, or sometimes sleeping too much. It's a shutdown mechanism almost. And post-traumatic stress disorder can occur from one traumatic event or a cluster of traumatic events. So in war, several episodes where the soldier has been in danger, in dangerous situation. In general life, if someone has had several bad accidents, then those complexities begin to add up. So it can be from one event or from several events. And I think what we need to understand is that these symptoms not only affect the emotion, the mind, the will, and the emotion, but they will affect the body, and they ultimately affect your spirit. So we're going to be talking about those kind of things in future broadcasts, and I hope that you will be able to join us again, to be able to continue this discussion. And please feel free to connect. Thank you for listening today.